Love watercolor painting, but not the setup today. Let's see if these colored pencils scratch the same creative itch. I've got a gorgeous new set to share with you that I think you'll like. And then I'll share my slightly wacky take on color swatching before we do what I call a dry painting, which is perfect for those days when you feel like watercolor painting, but you just can't be asked to dig out the brushes and fill up the water jars. I think we've all been there. Even though it's colored pencils, you're still using all your watercolor skills. Stick with me to the end and I'll show you what I mean. There is nothing quite like receiving an exciting package full of art supplies, and I've been lucky enough to have been sent this set of 72 coloured pencils by a Woomer to try out. I've never tried this brand before, so I'm very excited, and I have to say they came beautifully packaged, which is a really good thing because coloured pencils can be a little bit fragile and very frustrating if they start breaking when you're trying to sharpen them. So I'm encouraged by the fact that they are in a sturdy tin, which came beautifully bubble wrapped. This is a wonderfully large set of 72 saturated colors. So it's actually a double layer here. I'm lifting the one out using these handy little notches so that I can see the whole beautiful rainbow. How inspiring. There is a color chart that you can see that came on the back of the sleeve. So you might be expecting that my next step would be to recreate that neat little row of colors using the pencils themselves. I am indeed going to do some color swatching, but in my very unconventional way, which I think gives me a much better idea of the way I might like to use these pencils. Now, if you're having a little bit of art supply envy, first of all, I don't blame you. But secondly, I've got some discount codes that I'm able to share with you. There is actually a half price offer at the moment. Yes, it's a 50% off at Amazon, and I will pop the coupon code up on the screen. You can try that out. It's only valid for the first 100 redemptions, so you want to be pretty quick about that one. And if you do miss out, take heart, because there are extra discount codes, not quite as good as the 50%, but there are other really good discount codes that I've been able to share with you, and I've got those linked in the description below, so check that out if you think that you would like to add these pencils to your collection, or indeed choose them as a gift for another creative soul in your life. So let's talk a little bit more about why I've opted not to do the typical colour swatching where you create a neat little table and carefully label each of the colours so that you can refer back to it when you're using the pencils in another drawing or painting. I mean, that is very useful for that particular purpose. But I find, and you know, as a recovering accountant, it might surprise you to find that I don't really want to do those neat little tidy rows. I find that I would rather see how the pencils feel in my hand. I want to see how they're going to lay down on the page. And I want to tap back into that feeling that colored pencils used to give me as a kid. You know, they are so fun to use. It's so immediate, such an instantaneous color rush to scratch your pencil across the page and see these ribbons of color flow from the tip. And I'm very happy with these. I have to say I started with the yellows, and I'm not particularly very fond of the yellows. But as I got into more of the colors that I personally enjoy a bit more, the rich pinks and reds and blues, and my absolute favorite, the purples, I was enjoying them more and more. I really like being able to see I wanted to say brush strokes. I mean, obviously it's not brush strokes because we're not using a brush, but the actual pencil marks. I prefer to see that in colored pencils. And like anything, with all these art supplies, there are so many different ways of using them. And you can use colored pencils in such a careful way and lay them down so that it actually ends up looking more like paint. And these are oil-based pencils, so you can get a very neat, clean, polished, oil painting-esque kind of finish, but it's really not my personal favorite way of painting. They say the way you do one thing is the way you do anything, and I'm primarily a watercolor painter, and I favor a loose, expressive, free, joyful approach when I'm painting in watercolor, and I want to do my colored pencil drawing in exactly the same way. But there's actually a little bit more method to my madness here, because not only am I seeing how the colored pencil lays down, and by the way, it's doing that rather beautifully. I'm using a sketchbook that's got cold pressed paper in it. That's the same paper that I like to use when I'm doing my watercolor painting, because I also really enjoy that little bit of texture. A bit of texture, a bit of tooth in the paper is very good for colored pencil, in my opinion, and for the way I like to use it, because you can see some of that texture in the paper, and I really enjoy that. You know, again, it's personal preference. You have to decide whether that's something you enjoy or not. One of the other things that I'm doing is making sure that I am varying the pressure when I'm making my sort of scribbly marks here. I'm laying down the color, pressing quite hard to see how bold a mark I can make, and I'm pressing quite lightly to see what it's like when I lay down just a small amount of color. And this is typically where you can tell a little bit about the quality of the pencils. If you've ever colored with colored pencils and you're finding it quite hard to make the color show boldly, you know that they are not very good quality. And one of the drawbacks with that is that you can't get a nice variation in value. You know, you can't get darks and lights with the one pencil, because you're having to push quite hard just to get some color down at all. But because these are very saturated, very rich in color, it's quite easy to put a nice pale layer down if you want to do that. And of course, if you put a little bit more pressure, then you'll get a lovely rich dark version of that color. But the other thing that I am enjoying doing, and it's part of the method to my scribbly patches of color here, is I'm giving myself the chance to see how the different colors layer on top of each other. Because this is where colored pencils can be a little bit more similar to watercolor than you might have thought. What I'm noticing is that I can really layer on a second layer of color over the top of the first color patch that I put down, and that's working rather beautifully. That's a very useful thing for me to know, because it means that I can use the same sort of optical mixing techniques that I like to use in watercolor. When I say optical mixing, what I'm talking about is sometimes in watercolor, you can paint in these layers. So you kind of put down one layer of color, let that dry, and you can put another transparent glazing layer over the top, which means you'll get the effect of those colors mixing, because you can see the one layer through the top layer, you can see the bottom layer through the top layer. And exactly the same thing is happening here with my colored pencils, which means it is going to allow me to use the colored pencils in the same way that I use my watercolor paints. So that means when I'm messing around in my sketchbook, just enjoying playing with color, doing little doodles and drawings, I'm actually still using all the same skills and techniques that I use for watercolor painting. So the two kind of really work so well together. And this is one of the things I love to do. I find the sketchbook to be such a fun thing to work in. It's a really fun, supportive part of my whole painting process. And it's one of the reasons that I always include some sort of sketchbook project when I create a brand new course every single month in my Happy Painters Hub. So we do some sort of little project in our sketchbooks, usually using some sort of mixed media. Sometimes it's colored pencils, all sorts of different things. But whatever we do, it's usually very, very helpful when it comes time to do the actual watercolor painting for the month. So let's see what I've learned from my finished page. First of all, gorgeous, bright, bold color. I love the sort of energy that I can see in the page, and that's the kind of thing I want to put into all of my paintings. I'm also noticing that there are lots of lovely colors. So as you go through, you find little favorites. Light cinnamon, I think, is one I'm going to love. Some of these dark, bold colors that I will use to stand in place of black are others that I know will definitely be favorites in my palette. But I also really enjoyed the layering effect that I was getting. See how this blue, pale blue, has put a lovely cast over my dark colours there, which is just the way it would work in watercolour. You know, it's got that slight transparency. Here's another one where there's something transparent over the top, so the yellowy green is dulling down the purpley pinks here, giving this sort of neutral colour. And that's a very useful thing that you can use in a painting, just in the same way that you would do with a watercolour painting. So let's do exactly that. I found a painting I did a while ago, and if you want to see how I painted this in watercolour, I will link the video up in the cards. But it's this little path scene with some foxgloves and some distant trees. So I've got out my watercolour sketchbook just because it happens to be the one I had to hand, but also because I really like using coloured pencils on cold press watercolour paper. And then I'm sketching out with a pale pencil. I've chosen a pale sort of yellow ochre colour to do my sketching with. And this is one of the advantages of what I call this dry painting, is that there is no longer any division between drawing and rendering. But when you're working all in coloured pencils, you kind of get to do it all in one go. But I am doing the same approach of working from light to dark. I've started with the paler colours, and I'm going to start on the paler sections because I won't be able to erase, because these are coloured pencils, not graphite pencils. So working from dark to light, just like a watercolour painter would do. One of the most important parts of this little image is this contrast section where the pathway disappears over into the dark forest at the top and the nice light bright tree. So I'm going to pop in the tree, and it's at this point that I decided to swap to a nice colour where I can start actually drawing things in the colour that they actually are. And this is where it just becomes really fun. It certainly makes you feel like a child again, and it's, as I said, it's one of the things that I absolutely love about coloured pencils. And I really enjoy building up the colour using more than one shade. So what I mean is I'm not just choosing one colour to draw a green tree. I'm going to use lots of different greens and bring in some yellows and some darker tones to build up a tree that is much more interesting. And that is exactly the same sort of thing I would do when I'm painting. There are some gorgeous pinks and purples in this set of pencils, so I'm really enjoying having a chance to play with those, to put in some little marks to represent the lovely flowers that are on the side of this pathway. And I'm drawing them in pencil much the same way as I would paint them. I don't worry about trying to do perfect little botanical drawings. That's not my approach. I don't find that to be particularly fun. I've got lots of lovely darker pinky purples to choose from to add a little bit more depth and interest to these flowers. So it's really just a pattern of little lighter and darker marks, which are so fun to build up with pencils. And these pencils are lovely and creamy, and they're going down very beautifully and making my job much easier. I can do the same thing with the greens, using the kind of marks that I think feel a bit more like leaves and stems, remembering that they will be spilling out into the edge of the road. So I can build those up in and around the blooms that I've put in, and remember to do the same thing on the other side of the road, because on this little pathway there are these beautiful flowers on both sides. So I want to build that up, and I'm always remembering that I can go darker. So it's kind of a patient layering approach. You know, you start light and you keep adding where you think your drawing needs something. And this is one of the things that I think is rather lovely about working in coloured pencil, because it means that if you're doing something where you're likely to be a bit more often interrupted, it's much easier to be doing a coloured pencil project like this rather than a watercolour painting where you're worried about having to be aware of how wet the washes are, so that you can make sure that you drop in the colours while the wash is still alive, and so on, and use your wet into wet techniques and all that. But when you're working in coloured pencil, you can stop and start. So if you're in the middle of watching TV, or you're looking after children who are constantly interrupting you, or you're waiting at the doctor's office and could be interrupted at any moment, this is the perfect sort of thing that sort of calms your nerves and takes you away from the world, but not in such a way that you can't be disturbed at a moment's notice. So much to love about this way of working. For the more distant shrubbery, I'm choosing the bluer greens because when things are further in the distance, they do appear to be a little bit more blue. It's all to do with atmospheric perspective. So I've got a lot of other lovely colours that I can use here to suggest bluey green plants in the background. And of course, I can make my own versions as well by mixing up the colours that I use. So I can start with one colour and then adjust it as I see fit by starting to put in a few more marks with different colours. And it's also a chance to change up your marks. You know, if I used tall, stripy feeling grasses for the foliage in the front, maybe I want to use more scribbly marks for the ones in the background. And one of the important areas is to get that little dark section in where the path meets the horizon. I'll definitely be coming back in and building that section up with a few more darks. One of the colours and effects that I really loved, that I discovered when I was doing my wacky approach to swatching, was this cloudy blue colour and the way it creates a lovely glaze. So I thought I just felt like putting that in over the distant shrubs, because I also want to put a light section of that into the sky, just to suggest a little bit of a blue tinge to the sky. I want to keep the sky nice and pale. Otherwise, if you make the sky too dark in a landscape, the whole thing takes on rather a gloomy feel. So this is one area where I definitely want to be a little bit careful about not going too dark. Now, the pathway is another section of the painting that is quite light, but I do definitely want to give it a little bit more interest. I want to put in some horizontal marks just to remind us that this is actually the pathway going across. And I'm going to choose some of the nice warm brown colours to add a little bit of texture and interest in there. And importantly, I want to remember the shadows on the pathway. Speaking of the shadows, let's think about that little focal point, which is the dark section where the path disappears over the top of the hill. I'm choosing to layer in a few more dark colours. I've gone with the dark sort of indigo blue there, but I know that I'm just going to keep layering up different colours until I get a convincing dark. It's the same way that I would use watercolour paint. I never paint with black. Most watercolour painters don't tend to use a black paint, but rather will mix up various colours to come up with a dark. So I know that I'll have plenty to choose from in this set of coloured pencils to eventually turn this into a lovely dark area. I'm using the same dark colours that I put in that section to add a few dark sections into the flowers in the front. I want to make sure I put some darks to give some depth, to pop the front row forward and push the second row of foliage a little bit further back, as well as putting in the shadow where the plants meet the ground and the pathway starts. So it's lovely to be able to use these cooler tones. I'm always a fan of purple, so whether it's with paint or with pencil, you'll usually see me popping in a few purpley blues into these more darker shadowy areas. And I find purple to be a really nice effective colour to use to add dark sections, shadowy sections to greens. So I'm going to be doing that throughout my image until I feel like it is done. The question of when your painting is finished is always a challenging one. No matter what medium you're working in, whether it's painting or drawing, it can be hard to know when to stop. I did make a separate video all about that, so I will pop that one up in the cards if you'd like to see that. And don't forget, if you wanted to see the watercolor version of this particular little image, that video is also available in the cards for you. Whether you have the energy to get out the watercolor paints today, or whether you opt to just go for a dry approach like I did, I wish you lots of happy painting.